It had been a hard sleep, and Diarmid woke slowly, his brain sliding into place like a column of dog food muscling its way out of a tin. His dreams had been of interrogation and alarm, of dagger-pocked jail cells and American detectives pointing guns in his face. He couldn't remember when he'd finally gone under, but a glance at his laptop, now lying sideways as if attempting to eat the discarded cushion it now enveloped on the floor beside the bed, suggested it was midway through his 5th episode of Black Finch that evening. The screen was frozen on her, luminous and terrifying, as she faced down another perp in a fluorescent-lit interview room, chained to a desk scrawled with the kind of doggerel graffiti only the best art directors can achieve. Finding his phone under the pillow, he realised he'd vastly overslept, and had just 18 minutes until he'd be receiving the woman of his dreams. Outside in the rain, Monica eyed the directions on her phone. They didn't seem to match the flurry of commands she'd been issued by the woman in the hotel, or the man in the bakery whose assurances that her destination was only 2 wee minutes away seemed oddly contradicted by his insistence on offering her some wee buns for the journey. She fared no better with 2 hooded youths, midday drunk and blotted with matching stripes of barcode-thin facial hair, whose ability to communicate had been interrupted by their excitement to speak to a woman, and a glamorous American one at that. Not that she felt particularly glamorous right now, hair pulled, face unmade, cigarette in mouth, but she knew her fame, and had been raised to believe that famous people who pretended they were not famous people were gauche. All of their instructions had been in words, more or less, and Monica cheered at the fact she could understand their accents. It's just that she expected the reticle on her phone to move in unison with her walking, and she was puzzled to discover its intention to stay, stolid and immobile, at her starting point. In the end, Diarmid, like everyone else who had encountered Monica Logue since she landed, saw her first, and summoned her upstairs from the rainy streets with a stiff wave from his 2nd-floor window. "It's a pretty town," she said, meaning it wholeheartedly. "Yes, it has its moments," Diarmid replied, thinking her quite mad. He was surprised to smell cigarettes on her breath, although the thrill he felt at the intimacy of this sensation overtook any judgment. He led her upstairs to his home office, where the air was pregnant with airport antiperspirant. The room had the unmistakable look of somewhere hurriedly tidied minutes before, and Diarmid's recent industry was apparent in the fugitive plumes of dust that now sauntered over cabinets and tables, like spinning plates stopped but not yet reaching their full stop. "Thanks for meeting me," she said, her voice slightly tremulous as she handed him her giant parka and umbrella. "Not at all," he said, placing them on their own chair after a pause, a decision he immediately regretted for drawing attention to his baffled, frigid servitude. "It's an honour to meet you. I've been watching season 4 of Black Finch all week. It's a complete triumph. I'm hooked, but I'm only on episode 5. Don't spoil anything." "Oh, I'll have to have them send the rest," she said, smiling with such brilliance it took every atom in Diarmid's brain not to consider her one of his oldest and dearest friends. The emails had started weeks before, when Monica had first become attached to the project. Soon, it became known that she was very attached indeed. The agents had trilled that she was in love with Yvonne Mulvey, the headstrong matriarch of a family in 70s Derry, the emotional centre of Dead City, which was due to begin filming in a few weeks. A lavish prestige drama about the Troubles, to be filmed right here in town, had gripped the city in its imagination. Diarmid hadn't been surprised that the promise of fame, and maybe a few quid thrown in, had excited the city's inhabitants. But that this excitement extended to one of the world's most famous actresses had come as a shock. But soon after the agent's approaches, Logue had taken over the correspondence herself, peppering him with questions and serenading him with delight at the role, at her lines, at his writing. A few days later, she was arranging flights to come and visit the town itself. to get things right. This script, she said, pointing to her bag without opening it as she sat down. I really felt like I was in Yvonne's shoes while I was reading it. My family are from here way back, you know? Oh, whereabouts? Replied Diarmid, becoming every Irish person ever offered such a statement. The county Sligo, she said, in that odd, old-timey way Americans have of reciting Irish place names back to front, and with a definite article like the Brothers Grimm or the Family Stone. That's on my father's side. Antrim on my mother's. Ah, that's just up the road, really, he said, passing her the worst coffee she would ever drink in her life. Diarmid had sat down opposite her and now felt himself shrinking in the tractor beam of her gaze. It was entrancing in its strangeness, like sharing a coffee with a space shuttle. He felt like a low-life perp about to fold under questioning from this embattled, glamorous sleuth, dead set on catching out his every pathetic lie. He wondered if he'd be so intimidated if she wasn't famous, or if she hadn't made her name by playing flinty, capable and no-nonsense cops on some of the most well-loved shows on American TV. Monica's career had traced a familiar prestige path. Aged down to play missing teens in her 20s, aged up to play the mothers of missing teens in her 30s, and lately, as Eleanor Blackfinch, a detective who will stop at nothing to find some missing teens. Blackfinch was one of those improbably beautiful, but respectfully doutified homicide cops who marched onto crime scenes barking orders while fitting her slim hand-model fingers into her trademark satin gloves. She was his ticket to getting eyes on Dead City, a show he hoped would do the same for Troubles-era Derry, as she'd already done for people who sell satin gloves. She had found a place in the nation's heart for facing down murderers and rapists, picking up bullets with tweezers, or turning around dramatically to reveal important fabric remnants that had been missed by everyone else, but which now found themselves dancing a swift "I told you so" on the end of her outstretched biro. Diarmid had watched 17 episodes in the past 4 days. And as he passed her the coffee, he imagined it was not in a Sports Direct mug, which had been holding toothbrushes 15 minutes earlier, but a brown paper cup handed to her by an odd junior detective. As they slurped down own-brand instant lattes, Diarmid thought he'd settle for being one of her perps. Caught in her crosshairs in the interrogation room, tricked into confessing to defrauding an elderly widow, or that, yes, he was the last person to see that girl before she disappeared, but it wasn't what it looked like. Would be great, truly great, she said, as he snapped back to the room. What do you think? Well, it's all about getting the balance right, he replied earnestly. This was his go-to response to any question posed to him while he wasn't listening. She nodded sagely and flashed another smile. One so brilliant, Diarmid could tell it would stay with him for the rest of the sad, small life he would spend without her company. Speaking of balance, she said, placing her latte on the table, having to write it several times, on the dusty 14-year-old issue of Auto Trader he'd used to cover up the mould stain beneath. I'm struggling with the dialect. And the script? Asked Diarmid, with a haste that revealed he was ready to write anything she wanted in its place. No. Well, yes, but I mean in general. I just want to get it right. I've been trying back home, but now that I'm here... She pronounced the word here as if it was the only place she'd ever wanted to be in her life. I can hear the music in people's voices, the rhythm of their speech. I feel like I'm not getting it right. She pulled a notebook from her coat pocket, crumpled from her flight and covered in notes. On it were written numerous lines of dialogue. Here, she said, before jumping into performance. Sure the dogs in the street know what Paddy McMenamin is up to? No, if he wants to get past us, he'll have to rise earlier than that in the morning. Diarmid paused, now caught not in the blinding light of her charisma, but in the horror of one of the worst attempts at his accent that he'd ever heard. Like all Derry people, he'd heard a few. Time in London had revealed to him a passion among his English friends and workmates to repeat words he'd said in a cawed Irish twang, affecting an accent that might be placed somewhere between West Kerry and Narnia. But Monica's accent wasn't just broad or garbled, and it was both those things. It was nigh on incomprehensible. The worst Derry accents he'd previously heard sounded like leprechauns or angle grinders. Monica sounded like a crow trying its hand at Latin. It was an accent so bad he was forced to dedicate a third of the 3-second gap that sat, disconsolate, before his reply to working out whether she might be joking. "That was really good," he said, wishing he had the acting nous to sell his line, and feeling for all the world like a suspect who just told Detective Eleanor Blackfinch that the life insurance policy he'd just taken out on his wife was coincidental to her death by poisoning 7 hours later. "Really, Monica, it's a hard one to get down, but I think it's about the feel of the words. I mean, what I'm saying, it's good, it's really good. But also don't forget that Yvonne is more about attitude than accent. I mean, I presume you have a dialect coach though, yes?" "I do," replied Monica, folding the piece of paper from which she had almost certainly been about to read more. She's very good." That smile again. "She's been a great help. But I feel like I need to get out and hear speech in the wild. The real people, the real song of language." "Well," said Diarmid, "if that's the case, why not stick around? Take in the sights and listen to some people here. Take a few days off grid and soak it up a little. People wouldn't even need to know you're here, you know." At this, he gestured to the face masks she had tied about her wrist. "Soak it up," she repeated, though neither as a question or a statement. "Yeah, maybe I'll do that. Maybe. I have to go. Thank you for the coffee." In the weeks that followed, Diarmid would remember the smile she flashed as she handed him her cup, of watching her famous auburn hair vanish beneath her parka's massive hood as she opened his door, and of the kiss she planted on his cheek before her 50-foot smile disappeared behind her face mask and she walked out into the street like anyone else in the dim, grey town. Mostly, he'd wake and mine his phone for nightmarish emails from angry producers, following up on angry calls, which increased with every passing day, as schedules spun and juddered, deadlines came and went, and always, he'd find himself staring at her umbrella on his couch. It was a reminder so stark and terrifying that he was the last person to see Monica Logue alive. Attracta grabbed the tea from Declan, careful not to smile as she did. They were still fighting as far as she was concerned, and any hint of conviviality risked puncturing the thin film of frost she had applied to all her interactions since this morning. It was a hard thing to keep up, she'd realised, especially since they'd awoken together, breakfasted and driven all the way to the centre in which they were now observing this same steely silence while moving chairs and placing name cards. It was exhausting. Attracta's reflex, in fact the entire pattern of her heart and soul, was to utter a crisp murmuration of thank yous and sorries in every direction before she'd shaken the sleep from her eyes. But it wouldn't do to break the spell. Not this time. She'd had enough. Anyone would have, she thought, studiously pursing her lips as she peered through the rectangle of glass in the main hall door, and saw him laying out bottles of water for the attendees. Declan held the door open as she brought through the pastries she had bought from Doherty's on Hollywood's dime. Hollywood wasn't here yet, meaning the American producer, Vincent, who went by Vin but never Vinny, as his assistant had specified in at least 7 separate emails. But he was expected any minute. For now, The Foyle Valley Reconciliation Centre was the same as it had ever been, its beige walls streaked with damp and lined with slowly peeling posters for fun days and half marathons, sporting photos of Attracta, Declan, and the other volunteers peering out of giant costumes, wielding huge furry heads under their arms. There were more sober black and white notices for counselling sessions and meetings. On account of today's visitor, Attracta had it looking better than it ever had. She'd wiped surfaces, cleaned down the phones, and even shuffled the pamphlets on the spinning rack which tottered beside the fire extinguisher, so that the more dog-eared were hidden at the back. Usually when Attracta gave him the silent treatment, Declan called it the Grumpies, expressly because it annoyed her and, worse, threatened to make her laugh, which would ruin the game entirely. Today, sensing some deeper churning in the waters, Declan had foregone this step and remained sheepish and quiet, refusing to address the stern, impassive elephant in the room. The only breaks in the cloud came when another person intruded, forcing them to make a dog and pony show of normal behaviour. Attracta's face would soften into a facsimile of benign cheeriness, with a reflexive aplomb that hurt Declan even more. The first to intrude was their special guest, Vin but never Vinny, who was eager, perhaps a little too eager, to discuss what was about to happen. Vin inspected the name cards placed on the desks relating the names and affiliations of those invited. Séamas, Victims Alliance. Alistair, Prisoners Action. Joanne, Families United NI. Kieran and Finbar, Maiden City Muralists. Should I expect sparks? He asked, in a manner that implied that he would quite like some sparks if any were going. Should be friendly enough, said Declan. Will you want to say anything yourself? No, please. I'll be in the background. Just act like I'm not here. And if you need someone to show you around town, just holler, Declan added, to a polite smile. At this, Vin pulled a brown folding chair from the corner and placed it directly to the side of the tables facing in. He recoiled for just a moment when he felt the telltale hardness of chewing gum rub against his palm. Attracta shot Declan a sour look. Dusting the gum off the chairs had been one of the jobs she'd allocated to him in the email he'd said he'd read. The word about Dead City was that it was to be a prestige drama, as everyone in town had been saying now for weeks, aping the language from the one press release which had been repeated and quoted in every news item since its announcement. The Troubles is to be reimagined, with a lavish mini-series set in the 70s, exploring the impact of the conflict on local people and the human cost to family and community. Lavish, repeated Attracta when she first heard the news some weeks earlier. A lavish reimagining of the Troubles? What would that look like? Painting Free Dairy Corner in the Palace of Versailles? It's American TV money, answered Declan, pouring a short jet of hot water into the washing up liquid to get a last rinse out of it. They'll spare no expense, get the details right. Better than our crowd. Sure, when ITV did that Bloody Sunday film, you could see a Ford Focus in the background. Well, it'll be a Ferrari this time. What are you so happy about? Do you think you're going to get a job out of it? I might, Declan replied with a tone of mock injury, which quickly had him smiling idly at the thought. He considered himself very much within the biz, since he'd spent the 90s offsetting day jobs on building sites with work helping filmmakers capture the tone of Northern Ireland. This usually amounted to taking cast and crew on nights out to carefully selected pubs, during which he'd stage manage evenings of ordinary nightlife he'd timed out to a T, with almost every event and character pre-scripted to achieve the authentic experience they craved. I don't think they'll need someone to take them out to get sloshed on one of your theatrical evenings, Declan. But you could get a job in hair and makeup. Their moustache budget alone will be through the roof. I might and all, he said. albeit with greater volume than he'd intended. There'll be jobs going anyway. And what's your problem with the city getting a bit of publicity? Attracta arched her hand on her back and rubbed her forehead with her palm's heel. It's not publicity, is it? It's the same old muck. The show's called Dead City, for goodness sake. Is that what we are? Are we a theme park for ourselves now? Does it not bother you? This is the only thing anyone ever wants to talk about. If we are going to be talked about, said Declan, quieter now in the face of Attracta's ire, at least let us do some of the talking ourselves. Make a few quid out of it. Sure, it's worse when no one wants to talk about it at all. In the end, it was Attracta who ended up getting work from the production first. When they reached out to see if one of her reconciliation groups would take part in a mediated discussion with one of the producers, keen to invest their script with sensitivity, local colour, and a host of other words she expected would be used lavishly in future press briefings. When seats had been taken by the attendants, introductions were made, almost entirely for the benefit of Vin, since he was the only person present who hadn't sat in this room with these people many times before. Initial quibbles about seating were remedied by a quick switch around, which placed Annie from Victims Alliance closer to Vin, ostensibly because she was hard of hearing, but primarily because one of her 4 daughters was a great wee actress. It was agreed that Séamas, of the former Prisoners Network, would be placed beside his loyalist counterpart, Craig, an arrangement Vin quietly hoped would lead to fireworks. Unfortunately, for anyone seeking pyrotechnics, this was an arrangement the pair much preferred, since they'd spent a lot of time together on the lecture circuit, talking about their experiences on a cross-community darts team that had toured Europe in the 90s. These had been very highly regarded in the reconciliation community, both for their impact and, though never stated, the sheer brilliance of its grift. No one could fault their ingenuity in getting invited to speak solemnly about their experiences in community centres, historical societies, and taverns around Europe, and thereafter cheerfully hustling their hosts for cash at dartboards from La Coruña to Den Haag. It had, it was said, raised important and vital questions about the conflict, while also not raising its pitch too far beyond the realms of a lad's holiday abroad. The important thing is that this is done right, said Annie, to nods from her co-panellists. We see the same hoary old tropes getting their airing time and again. Leather jackets and moustaches, said Kieran, who had spent much of the earlier minutes asking Vin if he'd want to recreate some of the murals he'd painted back in the 80s. Barbed wire, prams on fire, doves on watchtowers, said his partner Finbar, who'd brought along a series of sketches to aid in their pitch. No Ford Focuses in the background would be a good start, said Joanne, whose organisation was named Families United NI. An organisation with a name so vague, Vin was still unclear if it was for the families of paramilitaries, their victims, or neither. Repeated requests that his presence was ignored had clearly fallen on deaf ears, as the participants avoided talking together entirely and directed most of their statements directly to Vin, now scribbling furiously like he was receiving their takeaway order. And where's Monica Logue? Asked Séamas. Yeah, is she still attached? Replied Annie, delighted to use the industry lingo. Of course, Vin said, with plastic in his voice. Monica is a big part of the show. She's just taking some time. He looked down at his notes as he felt that his projected confidence hadn't had the desired effect on his interrogators. I heard she's gone AWOL. Is that usual? Does she have minders? Bodyguards and that? My sister said she'd been seen in William Street baths, with her head shaved. Guys, I don't know about that. Now, would that be for the part? Is it the role of a bald woman? Or is it for a wig fitting? Could be, aye. A lot of them are bald, for the wigs. She could be just really handy swimming, interjected Alistair. My cousin Claire had the whole lot off when she was doing trials. Aye, right enough. Is she big into the swimming, Vinny? 'Cause there's better pools than William Street if she is. Once he'd caught himself scribbling down several different, better swimming pools in the area, Vin stopped writing and knitted his brow. Lacking anywhere else to put them, he placed his pen and pad on the floor. Monica, he said, is an unusual talent. Her method is immersion. She wants to soak up some of the local colour in these weeks, but she's still fully committed to the show. She's a big part of it, and, like all of us, she wants to do it right. But is she bold, Vinny? I think, he said, careful not to pause long enough to conjure further doubt, I think some of the rumours of her whereabouts have been unhelpful. Annie, cried Declan, can we get back on track here? Be a doll and tell Vinny about that cousin who got killed. Aye, she said, righting herself and sitting back in her chair. It was 1988, not far from William Street Baths, funnily enough. Finn flashed Declan a smile, as if to thank him for moving talk to a more pleasant topic. As Annie began her tale and Attracta started dispensing tea around the table, as others joined in, she was soon funneling hot water into cups, now moving wildly from the animated gestures of old friends telling war stories through cutthroat smiles. Attracta looked from cup to hand and hand to cup, and found she could no longer remember why she'd been angry with Declan in the first place. The ice cream works best, Turlock said, almost guiltily as he grabbed another scoop from the tub. Roisin had originally tried to keep him on pasta and creatine at least, but she'd long since moved those to the washing up cabinet. Whatever works, she said, trying gamely to hide her revulsion as she clacked her pen with painted nails. She made some notes in his rota for the week. You'll need to add some roughage, she said. You don't want to be bloated, you know. He did know. He'd tried a lot, but with 2 weeks to go, he didn't have time to try anything he couldn't stomach. The fellas in the gym had recommended milk by the gallon, heavy stout and fried chicken with the skin still on. One lad on Reddit said he'd kept a bucket of bananas by the bed and had trained himself to eat them in his sleep. All any of this advice had done for Turlock was to make him feel too full and nauseous to get much down before his head hit the mattress. Dinners were dreaded as the frontiers of his appetite were mapped, in ever-clarifying focus until every mouthful ached. He didn't want to make himself sick, but he knew his goals. Roisin was helping, writing things down, keeping him honest, stopping him from relapsing into fitness, even buying him strings for the guitar. Funny to think he'd never had much of a sweet tooth a year ago, but as he'd slimmed, primped, preened and shaped, happy dreams of sugary treats had haunted his every waking moment. Now that famine had turned to feast, he found he didn't know which he preferred. He clocked himself in the mirror as Roisin checked his weight. A toned stomach mocked him in its reflection, smooth, taut muscles which bulged like Adonic eyesores across his forearms, shoulders and neck. This wasn't good enough at all. You shouldn't have gone on that walk, love, Roisin said, handing him back the ice cream. See how much more you can manage before bed. He kicked himself about that walk. He said it was merely to give himself some air, but 5k later, he had felt the forbidden relief of calorie burn and cursed his productivity, knowing he'd have to mainline an entire extra punnet of chips and 2 milkshakes to offset his stupidity. His cowardice. Turlock Duddy had to get out of shape faster than any person who had ever lived, and he was running out of time. The character notes for Shawnee Mulvey had been clear on several points, but no mention of rippling abs was present in the text. The pitch document said he was spiky and pugnacious, a street-smart young buck with a sideways view of the world. Shawnee had been heralded as the conscience of the peace, the beating heart of Dead City's planned 4-series arc. Shawnee was a young man in troubled times, trying to choose a path between violent revolutionary, passive resistor, and punk music-loving teen. "It didn't say anything about punk music," said Roisin, who was placing 3 industrial-sized tubs of custard in the fridge. "Aye, but he has sideburns, Ro. Sure as eggs is eggs, he'll be a punker." Roisin tilted her head and squinted, like she always did when he made no sense. "There's only 3 types," he said. "He's a punker, I guarantee it." According to Turlock, anyone who'd ever watched any drama about the Troubles knew that the young men of Troubles era Northern Ireland must be separated into 3 distinct castes, roughly approximated by their facial hair. Clean-shaven boys were stoical marchers in straight beige coats, their brows furrowed by injustice, their hands calloused by the ever-present grip of a placard or a pamphlet. A moustache meant you were a hard man, or a rebel, and was so obvious a signifier of revolutionary intent that it might as well be grown out, harvested and knitted into a balaclava. Stubble and sideburns, on the other hand, were shorthand for the third and only remaining option, the music-mad youth who seeks an escape from the quotidian struggles of internment and gerrymandering via the same legacy-approved 14-song playlist of early 70s punk rock, to which every film distributor had long ago seized the rights. These were universally acceptable to the sorts of people, Brits and Americans, who don't like talking about Northern Ireland, but can be convinced to do so as long as the Troubles are made a colourful backdrop to the true universal drama of picking up a guitar in search of 3 chords and the truth. "If I know 2 undertones tunes and 1 stiff little fingers, I'll be set. I promise you," he told her, avidly pawing at his brother's battered Stratocaster any time the thought of another tub of ice cream was just too much to bear. "If this even goes ahead," he said quietly, "Monica Logue running off could ruin everything." "She's an artiste, love," said Roisin, placing her hand in his. "She's gone away to get things down. My cousin read she's rearing greyhounds on the Letterkenny Road. She's going method, like you." Turlock had thought his big break was in the Post the previous January, when he was plucked from obscurity in London and cast as Smax, the giant blue protagonist of a DC comic book adaptation for TV. The producers had set him a punishing regime and introduced him to trainers and dietitians who would put him through his paces. Where once there'd been the slight paunch of a 20-something actor, over the following months, he had bulked and preened himself into a formidable leanness. Everyone involved in the production had told him not to get his hopes up about the role, but they'd also sent him a 53-stage fitness plan, so he forgave himself for getting carried away. There were pipe dreams, he argued, and then there were those pipe dreams which involved regular weigh-ins and a lentil budget. Even still, these were aspirations he kept to himself. He was used to keeping his expectations low. His ma and da had made sure of that. He had long since stopped telling them about auditions, since they seemed to find the rigmarole of an actor's life depressing, even when things were looking up. Whenever he'd tell them about the stops and starts, the blank stares and forced grins from casting directors, the recalls and repeats of lines that were demanded of him, they looked at him like he was little more than a cup, desperately begging for tea to be poured in. Even his successes went unheralded. A Debenhams ad 3 Christmases ago had kept him solvent for 6 whole months afterward, and he had been initially touched by his mum's assurances that this would lead to more work. It seemed for the first time as if she'd started to appreciate he had a career, until it became clear she meant he might be able to get seasonal shift work in Debenhams itself, now that he had an in. "Did they let you keep the outfit you had on?" she asked. "In the ad?" "Aye, the uniform. I wasn't the worker, Mommy. I was the young dad." "All right. Buying the trampoline, The young dad, with the deaf son. Did you not watch it? Aye, of course, she said sympathetically. But did they give you a number for them all the same? When his casting as Smacks inevitably stalled, so too did the paid-for trainers and diet coaches, although their advice to him was still to be on alert for updates, since the situation could change at any time. Having spent a year attaining the physique, he had spent the 18 months since maintaining it, in all its tedious rigour, at his own cost. He couldn't even attend other auditions, since production could start back up again at any moment, immediately rendering any other plans he made inert. Soon he realised it was cheaper to live back in Derry, to work out, run lines, and escape the crippling rents of Hackney, since he couldn't even go up for parts anyway. He ran in the local park and made friends at the gym, met Roisin in the health food shop and slowly fell for the girl who was keeping him in lentils and magnesium, the fitness angel who played the harp at trad sessions 3 nights a week. Roisin was tanned and blonde by appointment, but had gained the ability to lift that harp over her head through sheer hard work, like a bandaged airman, besotted with his field hospital nurse. He entertained an infatuation that would have been tragic if she hadn't started keeping his supplements aside for him. Soon, they were helping each other on their runs, spotting at the gym and eventually stealing tentative kisses over spinach and hard-boiled eggs. And now that she was helping him undo it all with the exact same care and attention, he knew that it was love. Turlough was surprised to discover there had been so many people back home who were in good shape. The Derry of his youth had been one of beanpoles and fatties, all with dads who had never eaten a raw vegetable in their lives, and quietly ascended into middle age with Guinness punches and big, round necks. Every man over 30 cast the shadow of a pantomime dame, and yet here were men in their 40s, even 50s, who looked like they could model underpants, so long as they hired someone who was actually attractive for the face shots. Eventually, he realised that he'd effectively given up on acting and had actually just moved home. In quiet moments, he realised he had slipped into a more depressing fate than even his mam had ever presaged. He was now a cup professionally prohibited from having tea poured into it at all. His talk of the role that was waiting for him in America began to garner less sarcastic comments and more concerned glances, since he'd begun to sound like someone awaiting a $6 million deposit from a Nigerian prince. This was made all the worse when he was reduced to asking his parents for money to buy supplements and powders. "Here's a tenner," his dad said the last time he asked. "Maybe keep some aside in case George Clooney needs a lend." The DC show was finally shuttered, 20 months after it had begun. Even his parents didn't joke about it then, which was worse. Once or twice, he was sure he caught his dad about to make a remark, before a stern look from Roisin silenced the urge. Turlough found himself 24, poor, and the second or third best-built inhabitant of the job centre each Tuesday. 4 days later, his agent told him they were filming something in Derry. Something prestige. "Turlough," said the English woman behind the desk. She was flanked by 2 men on either side, who smiled weakly as she told him that she'd be reading Monica's lines today. "Thanks so much for coming." "No bother, hey?" he said, overemphasising the double L that stands in for a TH in Derry speech, an affectation he'd never possessed as a child, but to which now he felt committed. "So, in this scene, Shawnee has come home to tell his mother, Yvonne, that the army have seized your daddy." She pronounced daddy in the English way. It was the daddy of a bonneted child requesting an oversized lollipop from their father as he reads the paper fully dressed for breakfast. The flat daddy. The posh daddy, not the brisk short daddy he used all his life. Okay, he said. Turlough felt the nerves rising as he took his place. He summoned every ounce of self-belief he could, while still careful not to undo the hunch he'd practiced in the mirror to hide his fitness. He engaged his core to push out his stomach and applied a gentle thrust from his head into his neck in the hopes it might project the impression of a double chin he'd strived for. "Mammy," he said, through puffed-out cheeks and crumpled shoulders. "They got him. They got Daddy." He knew he got the part 2 weeks later, when his agent sent him a text to say they loved his audition. "There might be some shirtless scenes, though," he said, "so they want you to beef up a bit." "I can do that, yeah," he said. "Oh, and Turlough." "Yes? Can you play guitar?" Since the disappearance of his star actress, Diarmuid had to make changes to the script's 18th and final draft. It was not going well. They ranged from small things, adapting some of the dialect for the English actors and adding more jokes, to larger efforts like reshaping the last episode so that it struck a more upbeat tone. "Upbeat," he muttered under his breath before making a reminder, in pencil, to generate a happy ending for 1970s Derry. The meetings with Vin had been cordial but one-sided, with him barreling through changes from the producers and Diarmuid furiously scribbling. The whole process was made worse by Vin's habit of prefacing every critique with an obligatory unit of praise, almost always comically mismatched in scale. Each couplet had the discomfiting effect of a doctor who praises the health of your eyes and teeth before pointing to your heart and asking you to sit down. "We love the dialogue in the football stadium," he'd purred in one bravura meeting. "But we were thinking it would work better at a greyhound kennel. That's kind of a big deal here, right?" Around draft 5, he had hoped to query some of their asinine changes to the descriptions of the show's female characters, but was now inured to the fact that they would all be introduced to the world in dressing gowns and hair rollers, smoking fags with their arms crossed. At such times, he stopped short of saying it wasn't their story to tell, not least because it wasn't his either. The scripts for Dead City had been feeded by people he'd never heard of. There was amazement at his progress since he'd never been involved with TV before the retreat 2 years ago. This had been suggested by Martin, his agent, as a way to try something new. After his last play had been abandoned, the third such event in as many years. "It'd be a good place to get feedback," Martin said, "and share notes with other Northern Irish writers, dare I say. There's a bit of a vogue for it at the moment. It could be really fruitful for you." The "it" for which there was some apparent vogue was either Northern Ireland itself or Northern Irish writers. It was a thing that Martin hyped every few years, usually when nothing else was going well for Diarmuid. He dropped it into conversation, the way other people might announce the return of small plate dining or high-waisted jeans. It never seemed to trickle down to any actual work for Diarmuid, nor any appreciable uptick in Northern Irish storytelling elsewhere in the culture. And whenever a sitcom, play, or tell-all memoir did break through, the reaction seemed less "more of this, please," than "that'll do for now." Returning home from the delicious anonymity of London, Diarmuid found the North Star Writers' Workshop, curious by its absence of anyone he knew. Home gave Diarmuid the sense of something static and small, a cousin to that feeling he had upon finding the penis he'd penned in concrete as a child still adorning the back steps of his granny's house. The arty Irish friends he had in London were all frauds, he was sure, but at least they'd made it out. The frauds back home, on the other hand, lacked even the ambition for escape. He felt there was something insipid in this, if not unclean. It was even worse that they acted like theirs wasn't somehow a lesser life, promoting their little books and magazines, full of cod Irish phraseology and the small, busy metaphors of small, busy minds. He didn't own a television, but the only thing that interested him less than TV was people who said they didn't own a TV. So he kept this to himself, as an accomplishment he guarded like a trophy mistress. His last few plays had been aborted disasters, and he'd just killed the latest, bully pulpit, in the crib. He hadn't thought much of the others on the course, in the few hours of internet-enabled sneering to which he treated himself the night before, as a pre-bed pick-me-up for his post-flight hangover, while his sinuses recovered from being pulped and stretched like balloon animals. He sneered derisively at the self-penned bios and Twitter posts touting their work, especially those with no likes. These people, he thought, scrolling the writers' groups and support networks to which all his fellow attendees appeared to be connected. They all retweeted their circle of friends when they had new story collections out. Or if they'd attended events in small lottery-funded venues for local presses he had never heard of. Glancing through their bios, he saw an unbroken trough of mulched aspirations, scattered work in short film, some small-run plays, and poetry collections whose snippets provoked within him a black-hearted snarl of true contempt. His derision was particularly potent when it came to local talents. Local talent. What a thought. The beauty queen of the Burns ward. Find me a talented local, he thought, and I'll find you one who never had the guts or the gall to ply their trade somewhere they couldn't get their Auntie Mabel to come along to. Not for him the vanity of small successes on small stages. Some part of him relished the idea of being a noble failure, but only under a spotlight so colossal it might miss his miseries entirely. He wanted to dilute his aspirations and hide in the galaxy of numbers a big city provided. Beckett, Shaw, Yeats, Joyce. They didn't stick around because they knew their homeland would suffocate them. You could wear a turtleneck at the Sorbonne, an eye patch in Trieste. Try that on the Limavady Road and you'd be seen for the poser you were. The conference room in Lisburn appeared to have been designed by someone who wasn't absolutely sure it wouldn't be retooled as a hospice. Bright lights, stewed carpets, and bald furniture. The type of place where every door looked like an emergency exit. He arrived late on day one to find himself surrounded by people eating sausage rolls so avidly he entertained thin, cruel daydreams of it being the best meal they'd had in weeks. No one smoked except for Diarmid and the other oldest person on the course, Dampna, which he found disappointing on a moral level. Among smokers, he always wanted to be the best. Around non-smokers, he resented the hollow victory. He and Dampna became friendly immediately, when she sidled over to him, fag in hand, to assassinate the characters of everyone else there present. There were 12 on the course, roughly split between 20-somethings with resumes which were bright but sparse, and older ones, trying something new. We older ones are the worst, she said, smiling thinly, before pointing her fag at a white-haired man shuffling to his seat clutching a tote bag filled with handwritten notes. Your man looks like he's turned up too early at a wake. I saw him earlier asking someone where the biscuits were kept, laughed Diarmid. Practically begged. Like someone caught robbing from his church, forced to do community service with teenage gangs. Wonder what his story is. His show is about a taxi man, she replied. So I'd say that's his racket. It's a very literal crowd by the looks of it. What about you then? What are you in for? A change, he said, before outlining the divinely uninspired pitch he'd brought with him. Everyone had to come with one TV show idea, comprising a full series outline, character bios, and a fully written first episode. His was just Bully Pulpit's plot, about murderous hurdlers stranded on the Aran Islands, only lengthened to 6 inscrutable episodes. Dimpna shortened her eyes as she listened. "Jeepers, that's worse than mine," she said, before laying out a thinly sketched police drama, which even she hadn't the heart to describe in detail. "Still," she said, "no one here is bringing out their best stuff anymore, I guess." "What do you mean?" "The email. From last night. The Troubles thing." Diarmid stared blankly. "Did you not get it? They sent round an email, giving pointers and presentations, saying that there were topics and ideas they didn't want to go into. They listed things that everybody pitches, as bad examples to avoid. On it was stuff like people winning the lottery and prison escapes, people being forced to live back with their parents, and anything about the Troubles. The whole Troubles. Aye, I reckon every person here shat the bed when they read it. I had to make my replacement up on the spot. Had a whole 6-episode series written that was completely useless. Did you not see them all pacing back and forth this morning? Writing and rewriting in every corner. Place looked like a bookie's. It's a wonder none of them are smokers." "I only got here this afternoon," he replied. "So, what was yours?" "My what?" "Your first pitch. About the Troubles, I presume. Your labour of love." "Ha! Read it," she said, pulling a script from her bag. "You'll be the first to think I spent 2 months on it. And then they tell us they just want, I don't know, cop shows and sitcoms. Praise be I didn't tell anyone. Except my husband, God rest him. He must have thought there was more of an appetite for recent history." When Diarmid did read the first page of her script, some hours later, he winced at the title, Trouble, and found himself so fearful of further embarrassment he held it at arm's length as he continued. It told a story of 70s Derry through a strong matriarch overseeing a family of rambunctious teenagers, set against a background of internment and bombings. It was funny, with dialogue that zipped, and rich veins of pathos in the characters. She'd written 6 whole episodes, which he finished in an hour before he found himself pacing the corridor to her room. After knocking 4 times, he tried the door to find it opened easily into a silent carpet, her leg outstretched behind the bed. Diarmid screamed and ran to her on the floor, shocked to find her body warm to the touch, but useless in his shaking hands. The 9th person who tumbled in after that knew remedial first aid, but it was no use. She was carted away in an ambulance shortly after 9, as the event organiser spoke with police, who found nothing suspicious at the scene, save for some blood thinners and cancer drugs in her purse. "Sorry to hear what happened, Diarmid," said Martin, the following week, finding his client pensive and strained. They spoke of comas and resuscitation orders, and how it was the family's choice now. Whatever they wanted to do, God love them. "I don't know if they'll do another course, to be honest. Seems like they're all pretty shook up. How are you? Did you know her, particularly?" "Not really," said Diarmid, producing a bundle of 6 scripts from his bag, freshly retyped and clean from the printer. "And that sad business aside," he said, all smiles, "it was very productive." The notification started around 2 a.m. and continued through the small hours. By the time she woke, Deirdre had 43 messages, 12 missed calls, and enough blips on her timeline to suggest something had been happening, and quite a lot of it. She fixed glasses to her face and waded into the mire of another day spent obsessing over Monica Logue. Monica Watch had been in full swing since the glamorous Miss Logue had disappeared a week earlier, and sighting her had become something of a full-time job for the residents of the city, who'd been avidly eating up any and all updates about Dead City, the show that was now being made in their own hometown, despite the disappearance of its star. The Gazette's social media team was named Gareth, and he'd tabulated metrics and informed Deirdre that anything related to the show did numbers. So, they'd been printing the same rumours and rewording the same press statements every few days since it had been announced. When production geared up, photos of studio trucks and distant shots of location setups had proved popular for a while, but now that they had a bona fide celebrity missing in their town, this had gone into overdrive, and the Gazette had effectively become a one-stop shop for news of her presumed whereabouts. Gareth had proven himself universally useless at any task that had been put in front of him before social media had fallen into his purview. He was, to put it bluntly, the kind of open-faced innocent you wouldn't leave alone too long in case he fell into the fire. One of Deirdre's first interactions with Gareth was to tell him to stop picking inappropriate photos from Facebook for the obituaries. Mouths wide open on holiday, shirtless on beaches, drinking from bottles, even in full fancy dress. The dead have a look, you know, she counselled him. You know how you can walk into any house and see a framed picture and you can always tell if the person is alive or dead by it? No. Well, I can. She cycled through his Facebook and pointed to a picture of him, looking straight ahead with a quiet smile and soft eyes. That's yours, she said. That's you, forever. When you're dead, or missing, there's a bit of crossover there. As circulation and staff had dwindled, his talent for social media meant he now found himself as the digital media liaison for the entire paper. Even at this, he was a mixed bag. If it was your intention to discover anything that was happening in the town on any given day, you'd be better off asking a passing dog than to check the Gazette newsfeed, which groaned under the weight of spelling mistakes, errant addresses, and incorrect phone numbers with which he plied his trade. But he had proven himself something of a prodigy in the world of gossip, and particularly the hunt for Derry's most famous hypothetical resident. Deirdre had tried to resist all this, but the numbers added up. She'd begun a chat with the paper's board, apologising for the number of stories about Monica, only to be told they wanted more, and she'd be given time and staff to make it happen. People wanted to hear about the missing star, just like they wanted to imagine their city would be the cultural centre of the world when a show about its worst days was aired. For her part, Deirdre was less sure that she wanted to look back on the bad old days at all. She was loath to say it out loud, but things weren't what they used to be. Her old editor, Paddy McLaughlin, said anyone who talked about the good old days should be shot. Nostalgia, he said, was for the ill of mind or weak of memory, and it was no less than the chronic malady of the Irish population. Readers didn't agree, and over his objections, one section of the paper, way back when, became a standard part of the Gazette's weekend magazine, and one of its most popular features. He'd been editor in the 70s and 80s, and had resisted the slide into celebrity reportage and puff pieces about local businesses. It's fair to say he would have hated the job now. It was an era Deirdre often thought about happily, with so much fondness. In fact, it took a lot of effort for her not to call them the good old days herself. She'd worked her way up from the typing pool as a cub reporter, and some of her earliest jobs were for way back when. Interviewing locals about people, places, and events on whatever anniversary was coming up, and for which they had archive pictures they could use to fill half a page. Back in the 70s, the good old days were clear, defined. Nobody had a bad word to say about the past then, She interviewed the last woman to have worked in the shirt factories, who described 14-hour days in cramped conditions, sweating over plackets and buttons on subsistence wages, all with the glazed, faraway look of debutantes recalling a summer romance. The past was an ever-receding horizon of long, airy summers, or snowball fights in St. Colum's Park. The joy of open-air folk festivals and the pleasantness of seeing priests on bicycles. Almost all spoke fondly of a time 20 years ago when everyone was neighbourly and nobody locked their doors. Sentiments rendered slightly dubious by the fact that today's elders said the same thing now, 45 years later. Perhaps the bad old days all became good ones, no matter what. She had long since outgrown many of the old-timers she spoke to back then. A dizzying thought when she spent too much time with it. Her first interview for the Gazette was with a farmer who, when he was a child, met Amelia Earhart after she landed in Ballyarnett in 1932. The file photo, still pinned to her wall in the editor's office, showed a man who looked impossibly ancient but was only in his early 50s. She knew this must be partly down to the bias of her once teenaged mind, but she also couldn't help thinking that old people too were different in the old days. She knew people in their 50s who looked 30, ran marathons, used TikTok, and blended half their meals. The file photo showed a man with yellow eyes and chapped lips, a chapped face, even. He had one of those old-timey Irish faces that looked sore, with skin you could strike a match with, as if he'd spent some time in the International Space Station with the windows open. He walked with a stick and smoked a pipe, and when Deirdre asked how it felt to shake the hand of the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, he just said how nice her hair was, and how he was sorry to hear about her death, because he'd always fancied her a bit. You couldn't print that now, of course. The fate of the latest star to crash land in Derry was proving harder to discover. Gareth's outreach had found people determined to say they'd seen Monica Logue here and there, but nothing concrete. Deirdre did mention it might have been because he kept misspelling her surname, meaning their first full day of getting the word out had been using the hashtag #LookForLounge, which upset their search results and resulted in them getting ridiculed on Twitter by local furniture stores. It was on day 2 that Deirdre started getting phone calls. "I seen her down the baths in William Street." "Did ye, aye?" replied Deirdre, dubiously scribbling on the envelope she held in her hand. "Well, she wasn't looking her best, like. She thinks she had her hair dyed. Or covered, maybe. It wasn't a wig, anyway, I can be sure of that. But I check the baths." The next day, more came. "She's raising dogs in a greyhound yard out the old Letterkenny Road," said one. "Mending Irish dancing dresses in the Craft Village," reported another. Several said she'd been spotted in Brandywell Cemetery, watching Derry City play in the stadium below from the cheap seats. When aggregated, the sightings amounted to a truly baffling assortment of costumes, wigs, and body shapes, so they were either dealing with a constantly moving, shape-shifting spy, or a sizable cohort of the city's female population were being mistaken for one of the most famous actors on the planet in disguise. Nothing came good. Nothing had legs. Gareth didn't seem quite so unimpressed, and seemed to believe every single claim that came his way. Deirdre considered telling him that this was not generally a useful trait in newspaper reportage, but was moved by his newfound commitment to his work. He was in early every day, and had even gotten better, marginally better, at spelling. This was evidenced by the large map he was erecting on the whiteboard in the conference room, on which he had positioned pins and thread to triangulate every sighting. It looked like the work of a concussed child, hell-bent on catching a serial killer. But she was touched by his commitment. His tone, too, had changed. He had procured a tie and begun peppering his speech with cop show doggerel about witnesses and sightlines, and was now going through call logs and checking them against the phone directory to see if it would generate, in his words, further insights. If Deirdre had been initially irked by the focus of Monica Watch, it was too late to say. When her reporters started missing council meetings and protests so they could chase down yet more sightings, her objections fell on deaf ears from board members, who cackled with glee at the numbers and quizzed her on rumours they'd heard themselves. Worse, her own day was becoming preoccupied with calls from members of the public, who clearly thought it was the job of the editor to hear about their investigations. Maybe it was now, she sighed. Time was. The editor was the one who got the calls from the Provisional IRA to announce a bomb threat. She couldn't call it the good old days, and yet... Her door flew open as Gareth bounded in, carrying a ream of paper he was gripping with white hands. "You'll want to see this," he said, before depositing the pile on her desk. There lay the call log, assaulted with so much pink highlighter pen it resembled someone who'd been sunburned through a Venetian blind. "What am I looking at?" Deirdre asked, tracing the end of her pen down the list. "It's the calls," he said. "Almost all of them. They're from the same number. No matter where they say they're seeing Monica, it's the one person ringing all the time." They both jumped at a clang from her phone. "That's them again," said Gareth, glancing at the readout on the console, as Deirdre pressed receive. "Here," the voice blared through the speakerphone, in harsh Derry alto. "I've seen her. Monica. She was busking near the Guildhall. IRA songs mostly." "Who is this?" barked Deirdre. Gareth sheepishly tidied his notes, suddenly feeling like he was eavesdropping. "We know you've been ringing everyone, all day. Why? What for? Do you think we don't have better things to do?" The caller laughed softly. "Obviously not," she replied, before hanging up the phone. Gareth watched as Deirdre's frown twisted into a grimace, and then the thinnest, saddest smile he'd ever seen. "Why?" she said after a long while. "Would anybody want us looking for her somewhere that she's not?" The following is an email chain between the producers of Dead City, based in LA and Derry. One day since Monica's disappearance. Monday, the 8th of July. "Hi, Vin. Hope you're enjoying your time in the old country. How's the weather? And how's the food? Anyway, let me know what's going on with the Monica situation. People here starting to get antsy. Mark." "Hey, Mark. Weather here is awful. I don't know how these people get up in the morning. The literal air is wet. It's like walking through a shower curtain, even when it's not raining. I swear to God, the rain comes out of the ground and the walls. It's like being in a salad crisper. You know, like how when the barber mists your hair before the cut? That's what the air is like here, but all the time. That sounds like rain to you, right? But it's not. They call it summer. Everyone here still in tees and shorts. Some of the workmen go bare-chested and complain about the heat. It's 60 degrees. Everyone's real nice, though. Auditions going well for the smaller parts. Saw some great local talent yesterday. Food is better than expected. Like, way better. The bread is great, and the dairy is outrageous. I guess the cows like living in a giant open-air salad crisper better than huge concrete prisons. And oh man, they have this thing they put on everything. Tobacco onions. Thin, crispy, shredded onion coated in some seasoning. I've had it every day. I can't get enough of it. No word yet on Monica. Is she a flake? Seriously though, dude, look up tobacco onions.
Vin, are you being serious with me right now?
No word of a lie, Mark. That stuff's delicious. I looked it up and they started in Dallas apparently, but they've really taken them to heart here. Great with peppercorn sauce, steak, chicken, anything.
I'm not talking about the tobacco onions, Vin. Where is Monica? Have we got eyes on her? Where's her PA? We need an answer on this today.
Hey, Mark. Yeah, I've got people on it now. She's been seen around town. She's not needed till next week. I think it's just a method thing. If you need her brought to heel, we can call off her little trip and nip it in the bud, but I think it could be good for her, like Daniel Day-Lewis jetting off to Tuscany to become a cobbler. It's not like she's shooting heroin. She spoke with Dearmid, the writer. Bit of a moron, but has been doing some good rewrites at short notice. And she seemed a bit stressed about the accent, so I think this is just a little ego trip to get her out of her own head. Which he thinks it needs because her accent was in bad shape when he spoke with her. Is odd, though. Her rep at William Morris said she's never like this. Total straight shooter. So whatever this kick is, I don't think it'll last. Here's a YouTube link to the onions, man. We need to find a place that does it when I get back.
Okay, Vin. I'll not start a fire just yet. I can't deal with flakes right now. This is going down to the wire. Things are tense. You know, Len was saying in the morning meeting that we should pitch closer to comedy? That happy hour idiot's been mainlining Dairy Girls and thinks the script is too po-faced. I don't want to give him a win on this, but maybe some comedy in the dialogue would chill Monica out. Would Dearmid meet us in the middle there? And whoa, just watch that vid and that tobacco onion stuff looks good. Bring some back. I just searched for Irish cuisine in Santa Monica and it did not go well. Day 3.
Hey, Mark. Good to hear there was some movement on the script problems. I think we can make the changes without giving too many notes. Dearmid is so beaten down at this point. My guess is he's willing to do whatever. Man, did I tell you about the last meeting? We were going over the gag punch-up, trying to lighten things up, and he just goes, "Do what you like. Who even cares anymore?" And went outside into the corridor and stared at the smoke alarms for a bit. I think he's lost it. Either that or he's having acid flashbacks. Can we can him and get someone else in? Could be useful for some of the script revisions, since we want to make some changes to the ending, and maybe give Shawnee a bigger arc. I'll know more about the delays tomorrow. Everyone here is introducing me to the concept of dairy time. They're like Italians without the Vespas. Remember Naples for Da Vinci's bedroom? Worse. I had 6 guys here last night telling me it would take them 3 days to get the shovels they needed to dig me a hole. I think, since there's still no sign of Monica, they've just decided to down tools. And Dearmid is reeling over Dimna's death.
Oh, Vin, don't remind me about Da Vinci. Who's Dimna again?
Old-timer. Ran tours in the city and kept an archive of the place. Fell into a coma 2 years ago and died last week. Very sad. A few were invited to the wake. A proper Irish wake. You ever been to one of those? Dearmid showed up, absolutely loaded, and started crying over the coffin saying he was sorry. No one there even seemed to know him. He's well and truly lost it. Carl was sent down to fetch him and said Dimna, the deceased, remember, was just lying there in a coffin in the lounge, clutching rosary beads. She was made up and presented, very serene, but still, the whole thing was pretty eerie. Still can't believe they sent Carl. Of all people. He doesn't even wear leather and they sent him to go corpse watching. He found himself in the queue to greet the body. Is greet the right word? I have no clue, so Carl must have been completely gone. He says he overheard a few of the ladies there say, "Doesn't she look like herself?" time after time, and he thought he'd play it safe and say the same. So he walks up to the old guy next to him and said, "Oh, so I hear she looks just like herself." "Well," the old geezer replies, "since the coma, yeah. I swear to God, we should get some of these people to write the gags. They would do a better job than Dearmid at this stage." What's the deal with Ron? He's not replying to my messages. Are we still on for the Timothy project?
Yeah, about that, Ron has had to take a bit of time off. Apparently, the thing with his secretary has gone viral.
Mindy? The brunette?
I think we should talk about this offline, Vin. But no, not Mindy. Not yet.
Day 5.
So, Vin, hope you don't have pneumonia yet. I hate to say it. Have we thought about replacements for Monica? Are there local actresses we can use?
Yeah, some really good ones too. But the show isn't a show without her. This could be a disaster. Have we considered leaning in? Think about it. Right now, there is a lot of focus on the fact she's AWOL in the press, as if this whole show is going to be a disaster. Why don't we work it in? Have her disappear in the show, write it in. Maybe she's been seized by the IRA or the Brits or something. It's not impossible. In episode 2, when the dad is taken, why not make that her? If nothing else, it'll buy us some time till she comes back. And she will come back.
So, Vin, you want to sack our existing writer because he's made the show too dark and change the script so that our most likable character is missing, presumed dead?
Yes.
How soon could you get that script together?
Day 8.
Hey, Vin. So, Ron and Len are both gone now, so any emails you've sent to them won't be actioned. I don't think that's the last of it. And if you ever got any of their Tuesday Honey emails, I delete them now. And delete this too. Actually, I don't think we should be talking about any of this.
Too bad about Ron, but Len had it coming. I always hated those emails, and I'm not just saying that because the investigators are probably reading this out in court in a few months' time. If you're listening, guys, let us know what you think of the new script. Attached.
That's not funny, man. Script is better, but what's with the change of pace in the last 2 episodes? I thought we were going for something more upbeat. And please tell me that Freak has returned from going native. The studio has given us 1 more week, but that's it. Or we have to shut this thing down. I'm being sent screen grabs from the local press about her rearing greyhounds somewhere. Is this a joke? Do we need to start culling greyhounds, one by one? I can probably get budget approval. Note to the investigators reading this is a joke.
Day 11. So, Mark, you've probably heard, but Dearmid's on his last warning. He stopped coming in, and we're getting close to pulling the trigger here. It's like he's completely forgotten how to write these characters. Everything comes back more maudlin and tortured than before. I asked him to spec some ideas for an extra episode, and he came back to me with a 3-page draft about hurdlers or hurlers or some nonsense, murdering each other on an island somewhere. I don't think I can take it anymore, man. I've heard nothing about Monica. No one's heard anything. Or, actually, we've heard too many things. She's been cited more than the Virgin Mary. But we've put the kibosh on anyone talking. We're using the extra time to make some good stuff. We have the original mural painters doing a recreation of their work in the backlot. And we got the permit for the local soccer stadium for one of the match scenes. All the delays could still work in our favor, is what I'm saying. We might be able to push things through with the music angle, though. Turlough, who plays Shawnee, he's not bad on the guitar. Needs to slim down a bit, though. Can I say that here? I don't know the rules anymore.
Vin, hold fire on the tone. Now Len's gone. Did you read the Atlantic piece on him today? Man, he was a sick puppy. We can probably go darker. It was him and Paul that wanted it to be more like a sitcom, and, well, Paul won't be around much longer either. I'm surprised he wasn't the first to go, to be honest. I absolutely love the music angle, though. Punk, the Troubles, funneling that negative energy into music. That could be a great arc. He wants to get away from everything around him through his music, that kind of thing. Billy Elliot meets the undertones and stiff little fingers, maybe. I think we're really onto something. This could be great. I think Irish people are crying out for a new story, and it's only right that we give it to them. You could be returning home an official Irish hero. Just make sure you bring some tobacco onions back with you.
Mark, if I return with a live Monica Logue, they should give me the Emmys on principle. The gunman on the wall was sitting as pensive and alert as anyone with half a face had a right to expect. In the crook of his arm, an Armalite was slowly taking shape, but his body was still a mess of lines and cross-hatching. Finbar popped the brush back and pondered the reference photo another while. "Still having trouble with the hands?" asked Kieran, in between puffs of his vape, which sent sickly clouds of vanilla across the scaffold to his partner. "Never you mind my hands," said Finbar, clearly minding the hands. "I've won awards for my hands. I'm better at hands now than I was then. I'm trying to get it to match. You should do the same." Kieran took up his brush again. He'd forgotten how touchy Finbar could be, but he was also surprised how rusty he was himself, trying to recreate the work he'd done 3 decades earlier. "Want to swap?" asked Kieran, after a discreet moment had allowed the funk to pass. "I can do the gunman. You could start with the dove." "You do the dove." "You did the dove, so you do the dove. We do it the same." "It doesn't have to be root and branch the same as before, man. We can vary it up. Treat it as a creative exercise. Get out of our own heads a bit," said Kieran. "I like being in my head. Where else would I be? And anyway, it's my head, not yours, so I'll keep it that way if it's all the same. And what's the matter? You sick of doves now? No one made you do it in the first place. I seem to remember Alan begging you to stop putting them everywhere. You had doves on swings, and doves in cars, doves in lighthouses. That was a round tower. The place was falling down with doves. You know it was a round tower, Finbar." Kieran had overdone it with the doves, he freely admitted. At the time, it seemed like a symbol that made sense. Now it seemed cheap, chintzy even. "I'm having a fag," he said, before starting to descend the scaffold to the plastic sheeting beneath. "You've been puffing away all morning," shouted Finbar, by now cursing his way through the shading on the provost's gloved fingers. "The vape is for painting. Fags are for breaks. If I smoked fags up there, I'd never stop." From below, Kieran had a better view of their work in progress. A Moment in Time was one of their more celebrated murals, which had once been on the side of flats in the Bogside, but had been torn down with them when it was decided they were unlivable. The cost of progress, Alan had said. The 3 of them hadn't painted as many as some of the more well-known lads, for whom they were often mistaken, but the 8 or 9 they had done had once been prominent. None remained. All had been torn down without much fuss in the end, surviving only in coffee table books and photography exhibitions. no money from which ever made it to them. When Alan moved to Germany, one of his exhibitions had tea towels of the mural on sale, and they had to chase him down for their fair share of the proceeds. Finbar liked to say that had been the end of things with him. But Kieran knew it was just a final, acceptably bad sin for which Finbar could make his long, festering resentment public. Alan had gone off to make a living in academia, and they remained at home, teaching and occasionally painting when the opportunity arose. Not that they were complaining now, since the commission from the TV people would be more money than all the tea towels in Cologne. A Moment in Time was undoubtedly their most famous work, made in the 80s and famous for its non-traditional tableau of disparate elements. On the lecture tours to which Finbar and Kieran were rarely invited, Alan would say it was an impressionistic piece, reflecting on all the things that were, and could be, in the town. It had been on the front of a few books and several album covers. They'd seen replications and tributes to it on walls from Havana to Le Havre. So, when the Americans rang to see if they could recreate one of their murals for the production, there was no doubt which one it would be. It was beginning to look like itself. He had to agree. But not enough like itself for their satisfaction. At some points, it was too accurate. Finbar hadn't been lying about the hands. He had improved over the years, and here he was now, aping his old style, warts and all, for verisimilitude. It was hard not to wince at those old lines, laid bare now in full technicolor. He'd tried to round some of the edges and trim some of the draftsmanship, but Finbar had overruled him. Maybe he was right, and it should be kept the way it was. But it seemed a bit too puritanical for him. It also looked rubbish, which wasn't ideal. All Kieran could see was his mistakes. Over-keen strokes, poor handling of depth, a sense of perspective that was shocking. Everything flat and overdone, and subject to lighting that was so evenly distributed, each oven-glove hand and store mannequin face appeared to have been captured 6 seconds after a solar flare. He had joined the crew when he was barely an adult, and his capabilities were somewhat outpaced by his delight of working with artists he respected. Back then, he had basked in the beautiful ignorance of youth, filled with boundless energy and sufficient inexperience that he couldn't see his own faults. Now, some of the stuff that was printed in books and tea towels was, well, mortifying. Wonky, unpolished, filled with cliché and overstatement. He could see it in Finbar's work as well, but would never tell him. A small part of Kieran surmised that the trouble Finbar was having with the gun wasn't due to a poor approximation of his youthful output, but the selfsame artistic frailties that had rendered his gun so plastic and ill-shapen in the first place. The original idea had been to get a digital reproduction added in post, but they had more time at it now because the show's star was still missing. Officially, any mention of Monica or her extracurricular voyage was verboten on set. It was funny watching American crew tell the local staff not to gossip. Efforts that carried all the authority of an embattled substitute teacher telling students not to mock his ponytail. Telling Derry people not to gossip was like trying to talk your way out of sunburn. Finbar and Kieran had heard a dozen theories since they arrived, almost all of which had been delivered with the sincerity of known fact. Even the fella who said she was living as a Sikh on the waterside would have sworn that claim on his granny's grave. What wasn't known was how true the show would be to real events, but this doubt was usually offered with the ambivalence more common to guessing the weather. Everyone on the crew joked about the way their friends and family talked to them about the show before and after they'd got their gig. Not that Derry was an argumentative place, of course, but it had been noted that wives and dads and cousins who had seemed delighted about the show when they'd first heard about it were suddenly riven with reservations about its authenticity once they had an opportunity to talk with a member of its crew. None of the crew much minded if the show would be authentic, and it was broadly agreed that murmurs of discontent among their friends and family were likely coloured by the fact that they hadn't got jobs in the production themselves, and that any such qualms would be swiftly silenced by a few days' work. Certainly, it had been noted that those who fancied their chances at a shift here or there in the next few weeks hadn't been forward with their objections, lest they be forced to backtrack once a call came in. They'd both taken on half of Alan's contributions to the wall, since they couldn't think of a better way of working out who would do what. His text message had just said, "Whatever way you like, all the best." Both had been relieved he wasn't interested, but mildly aggrieved by the degree of his disinterest. "Heard from him much?" Kieran asked, once he'd swiped fag ash from his bottom lip and ascended the scaffold once more. "Not this last while, no," replied Finbar. "He has another book coming out, according to Facebook." They'd seen Alan every few years since, and things were cordial to a point. Kieran was always happy to see him, to talk about old times and check how he was doing. Finbar was less willing, and spoke of his old friend like a spurned romance, or a dog he'd had to put down. When they used to meet, it would be in Bennigan's, for pints that started cheerily vacuous and then chilled when Alan got to talking of his accomplishments. He couldn't help himself. The books, the tours, the progress of his students, all doing books and tours themselves now, of course. "With glowing acknowledgements to their Führer," as Finbar was of mind to add when they nipped out. "They change when they go to Europe," he'd whisper angrily. Dear God, they head over for the money or a woman, and before you know it, they're sticking lines through their zeros and putting eggs in the fridge. Kieran didn't much mind the eggs in the fridge, and suspected Finbar didn't either. But while he'd never much thought of the success Alan had garnered, it seemed to be a steady percentage of Finbar's mental outgoings. Kieran had been barely an adult when he started with the muralists, and had taken nothing but joy from those years. Finbar couldn't talk about the old days very long before the words soured in his mouth, caught in the unhappy tryst of believing them to be the best years of his life, and a source of resentment ever since. Before Alan left, he had been demonstrative and philosophical, which appealed to Kieran. Finbar was more about craft, which enthralled him in other ways. When they'd first met, Kieran had thought they were both good friends, and only gradually came to realise the rifts between them, like a pet brought into an unhappy home. When things had finally soured at the end of the 90s, jobs were split up so that they'd do their bits separately, so Kieran rarely saw them together after that. Both spent the entire time bad-mouthing the other. When Alan had said he was leaving for Koblenz and asked Kieran if he wanted to join him, he didn't realise it was a long-term offer, and he, the cautious puppy, caught between two owners patting their knees and saying, "Here, boy, come, come." In the end, he stuck with Finbar, because it meant stability. "No hard feelings," said Alan. "Come and see me sometime." He never did. The work dried up for the dairy boys. He married, settled down, and though never as resentful as Finbar, he did occasionally dream of tea toils. If this was to be the end, at least he'd get paid. And at least the old days, for all their ills, would exist somewhere forever again. He turned back to his dove. He applied top coat again to start fresh, and took his time to make it look as real, as bad, as it had before. This wasn't the job for a romantic. "Do you think this'll be any good?" Kieran asked. Who knows? If you sort the doves out, I think we'll be laughing." No, I meant the show. Dead City. Do you think it'll be any use?" Who knows," said Finbar. as the gunman's eyes took shape against his own. "I won't be watching anyway. Doesn't do to dwell in the past." Declan checked his watch and found it was 13 minutes past 9, just as it had been each of the last 4 times he'd checked. He tapped the screen to make sure it wasn't broken, causing the time display to vanish entirely, replaced by a counter showing his heart rate and measuring his steps in real time. "Ah, jeez," he said, clicking the side buttons and tapping the screen in the hopes it would resume telling him all time was at a standstill, instead of doling out each of the pulses it could register before he died. It was his own fault. He had bought it himself a few weeks after his 60th birthday. Atracta had misinterpreted his request on that occasion and came home from work with a smartwatch, as in, one she thought would look smart in a suit. It was left to Declan to discreetly buy this one a little later. The hope was that he'd wear it on the runs he did every couple of weeks in an attempt to spark some fire of fitness, which had never previously taken light in the preceding 40 years. The instructions were in Latvian, supplemented with little cartoons which were provided for the benefit of people who either spoke other languages or, he supposed, people who were Latvian, but in a rush. They all appeared to show wrists on fire, or people electrocuting themselves in bodies of water, with cutesy red X's beside them so as to make it plain that this was merely an undesirable but alarmingly possible outcome. In the 5 years he'd owned it, he'd barely run 20 miles, and had not set fire to himself. But he had managed to render its clock face unusable roughly twice a day, and he supposed the stress this caused did get his heart pumping at least. As a tanned hand clapped itself on his shoulder, he could see it was 20 past, at last. "Sorry I'm late," said Vin. Declan forgot about the passage of time long enough to say, "No bother at all. Come on in." The door of Podrick swung open, ejecting a warm breath of lights, music and chatter into the frigid street. The plinking strains of Irish music followed them to the bar as he watched Vin take it all in, smiling. "Wow, you weren't kidding," he said, angling his neck to take in the roof beam stuffed with street signs and the harpist in the corner. "This place is gorgeous." "Aye," said Declan. "If you want to see the real town, there's no better place for it." Declan had been showing Americans the real town for years. Actors and film crews mostly, people who needed a Sherpa to guide them through the foothills of Derry's culture. "I take it Monica won't be joining us," he said, as they took a seat near the harpist. "No," said Vin cautiously. "I guess you've heard she's still on a break." Declan smiled faintly. "She'll be back soon enough," he said, before looking around theatrically. "Sure, maybe she's been hiding in here this whole time." They shared a soft chuckle as the barman approached with their pints and started to speak. Declan lightly grabbed his hand. "Afterwards, Aidan," he said, sending him on his way. His pulse quickened. A night like this didn't happen by accident. The work for this evening had begun the previous week, same as always. The bar had been empty then, at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, with no one there save Declan, Atracta, and the best co-conspirators he could find at short notice. In this case, Roisin the harpist, who worked in the health food shop, and his sister's boy, Aidan, who, whatever his faults as a barman, plumbed new depths of mediocrity as an actor. "It's simple," Declan had told him, a full hour into their first rehearsal. "We walk in, me, Vin and Monica. You say hi. You act interested but not starstruck. Charming but not chatty. As we sit down, you get to saying what we agreed about the local lore." "Cue Aidan," shouted Declan. Aidan failed to move. Am I Aidan, or am I playing someone else? You're playing yourself. Or a character like yourself, but the name is still Aidan either way, so listen out for it. It's hard, isn't it, when the lights are on you? There's no lights. Just normal lights. Like right now, in this pub, where this will be taking place. Roisin, is it too late to get your fella here on the night? Declan, scolded Attracta. It wouldn't make much sense to have Turlock here if he might be playing her son later on. Come on now. There was a sigh before Declan called out action once more. Yes, Declan, resumed Aidan. What about ye? And who's your friend? You new in town? Aidan, for crying out loud. What? Don't act like you don't know who she is. She's Monica Logue. Everyone knows who she is. I thought we weren't supposed to act starstruck. Not like, super fans. But you don't act like you don't know her. She'll be either insulted or she won't believe ye. She's not that famous. My ma wouldn't know who she was if she wasn't in Dead City. But she is in Dead City, Aidan. Do you not understand? We have to make her feel like everyone knows who she is. But also that nobody is freaked out or weird about it.
Like seeing a teacher in the cinema, offered Roisin from the corner. Like you're thinking, what's she doing here? But you're not going out of your head or anything over it. Declan made small fists with his hands and blinked 4 times. Roisin, you're only here because you know how to play the harp, and that bit comes later. So please leave this to me. But there came a pause. Would that help, Aidan? To imagine one of the world's most famous women is Mrs. McLaughlin. Nah, said Roisin. He knows her too well. You chat to her, Grant. Maybe someone more glamorous, or at least someone you don't see as much. Mrs. McLaughlin's only 2 streets away. Mrs. Deaney, countered Aidan, now counting on his fingers as if recalling more distantly known teachers required precise arithmetic. Aye, said Roisin. Wait, do you fancy Mrs. Deaney? I actually did see her right enough the other day. Thank you, Roisin, barked Declan. That's loads to work with. Go look at your harp. Now, she comes in, and you act like she's... What's her name? Mrs. Deaney. Yes, Mrs. Deaney. And I introduce you, and you say, it's nice to meet you, excited about the show, yada yada yada, and then you say, all right. Here, Declan, about that thing you were asking me the other day. I was actually talking to me auntie about it. And I say, not now. Monica doesn't want to hear about any of that. Catch me after. Then we walk to the table and she says to me, what was that about? Wait, said Aidan. Are you writing lines for her as well? I know these people, said Declan. They always ask. They're inquisitive. They're on the hunt for local colour, for character. This is their bread and butter, let me tell you. When Brad... A groan erupted from Roisin and Attracta. When Brad was here, he shouted above the chorus. He barely asked a question. I had to feed him everything. I had Puff Clancy borrowing beer mats and telling him about the hitch blocks. There's ways of doing it. You just need to move the script about a bit. The same goes for the casting, by the way. So if you don't want to do this anymore, there'll be plenty others who want a few quid for a night's work. There's the door. There was a pause before Aidan tilted his head thoughtfully. What was he like? He asked. Who, Brad? No, Puff Clancy. Of course, Brad. Good lad. Sent me letters after. Now see, with him, I had to play up the prison angle. He was playing a provo, so I had to introduce him to a few salty types. Provos? Well, not exactly. This was the 90s, so the producers weren't much keen on him meeting the real deal. Puff was good, though. Told him about prisons and that. Puff was in for shoplifting, shouted Roisin from the bar. Aye, but he was in with some of those lads. And sure, what's the difference? I don't think they put political prisoners in with the fellas that robbed from HMV. I had to work with what I had, said Declan. And In the end, if Brad doesn't need to be a provo, they play a provo, why does Puff Clancy need to be one? That's the thing yous don't realise about this business. You make stuff up and turn it real. That's the gig. It takes craft. It takes work.
What about the fella that got his head kicked in doing this? Asked Aidan.
That was in Belfast, Declan snapped. A few years later, he was on all the wrong places. And what did they get out of it? A film that was actually made, shot Roisin. Eventually. But in the meantime, a battered megastar and a new wardrobe for everyone in a pub in Andytown. You can't do that now. It'll be on everyone's phone. And you definitely can't do it with Monica Logue. Wouldn't want that in the papers, sighed Attracta. Monica Logue, still missing, presumed head kicked in.
So what are you doing for Monica? Asked Aidan.
Like I said, in the email you clearly did not read, but anyway, she asks me what the crack is with you, and I say your mam was in the petrol bomb station.
My ma?
Asked Aidan.
Aye.
And she told you all about it. So I tell Monica, and then she tells me to tell you to tell her all the stuff in the email. About how the lads were making the petrol bombs at the start, but they kept doing them wrong, so it was all woman after that.
Is that true?
Aidan, said Attracta, rising from her seat. You had lads up there, covered in petrol and broken glass. Lads who'd never cooked for themselves, who'd never followed a recipe before. The bombs were going off early half the time because they stacked them wrong, and the wicks were different from bottle to bottle because these fellas had never worked in a factory. Us, our mothers, our aunties, we cooked all day and had been on assembly lines our whole lives. So we kicked them off and got the job done.
Well, shouldn't you tell her all this? Asked Aidan.
I have, Attracta paused, other responsibilities on the production. She'll know my face. It wouldn't do for me to be telling war stories. I've let them dogs lie and they may sleep on. And anyway, Aidan, said Declan, you're cheaper. Aidan had been cheaper, which was small comfort to Declan now, since Monica wasn't coming and all the night's preparations were useless. Without her to impress, they were just two guys drinking in a bar where the harp music was a bit too loud.
Do they usually have a harpist here? Asked Finn.
No, said Declan, surprised at his own honesty. I asked her to come in. I thought it'd be nice for you both.
Vin smiled. The authentic experience,
he said, chuckling.
Well, forget that. Why don't you just tell me about the town?
Where do I start? Said Declan, before deciding he'd begin where he could. His childhood, his people, the 70s and everything that came after it. Watching the undertones in the old cinema, sneaking into the cemetery to watch dairy matches from the hill, even being chased off the roof by old woman because he couldn't make a petrol bomb fast enough. Vin didn't scream in horror, much less write anything down. And the stories tumbled out, unchecked and imperfect, true to life and unburdened by any pressure to be real. Declan checked his watch to get the time, and found his heart rate there instead. It was low enough that he was forced to admit that he was enjoying himself. It looked like a crowd scene from where she was standing. The one at the football match before the trouble that kicked off with the away fans. The kits looked era appropriate. A lot of work had clearly gone into them. She hoped they'd save a few for the local boys. Sure enough, there were young lads huddled in a corner, waiting for something. Perhaps they were extras. Or hangers-on. No one in the stands. Maybe they added those in with CGI these days. Toward the dugout, she could see important-looking people in headphones gesturing around monitors. She could just about hear them talking in that distant chatter way of any faraway scene. But the meaning of their words was lost. Directing seemed to be mostly pointing and shouting, she thought.
and waiting around to shout and point. Big lorries were making a marvellous industry of the rigging and lights that were being trucked to and fro. The modern signage was being modified to have the old products and typefaces she remembered from when she first went to games. And everywhere she could see ant-sized people running around with clipboards across the green. "Funny you can make out the clipboards from here," she said. "There's a way someone walks when they have a clipboard, like they're on a mission from God." Jim said nothing in reply. He rarely did now. One of the men with clipboards was screaming, hands raised like a preacher. A tall man, who she knew only too well, was screaming back. She couldn't see if he was crying, and was surprised to find she wanted him to be. "There he is and all," she said to Jim, who said nothing. She'd first spotted Jim here 2 years ago, between his death and the writer's retreat that he had paid for, which would put paid to her in the end. She'd only told Deirdre she'd seen him, who looked at her sister like she was crazy, told her as much and demanded that she never, under any circumstances, tell anyone else, as if she was the repository of all secrets in the town. In fairness to Deirdre, she wasn't a gossip, and in Derry that's roughly approximate to having a superpower. Half the town would go through your bins if they thought no one would find out. The rest would pay to read their findings. It was just that, in Deirdre's case, it didn't seem like discretion so much as disinterest, as if a lifetime in the news business made her squeamish about attracting any attention to herself and paranoid about paying any attention to anyone else. Perhaps that was more moral than the opposite course, preferred by most people, which was to scour the lives of other people for recyclable goods, but affect a censorious bafflement at the idea anyone might do the same to you. But part of her couldn't help thinking, if she'd mentioned it to Dr. McGarvey, they might have found it sooner. They might have done something. Well, it didn't help to dwell on it here and now. There'd be all the time in the world for that. When they were first courting, the Brandywell Cemetery was the best place to watch Derry matches, if you hadn't the fiver to see the game. Or, if you couldn't be arsed parting with it for the chance to be rammed in like hens, or to have a talk and mingle and be seen. What is it they say about London? You're never more than 6 feet from a rat? Well, in Derry, you're never further than 6 feet from someone about to ask how your mammy is, and who has the time. The real reason she preferred the cheap seats was because the crack was simply better. And it was a better night out for a girl back then. The illicitness of a graveyard rendezvous on a Friday. The match merely ambient noise for an evening of quiet, awkward seduction. Try doing that with 500 lads screaming in the jungle stand during some wet 0-0 against Glentoran. In the decades after they got together, having a few quid meant they'd go to the games proper, standing in the terraces. And it was never the same. She still longed to be 17, rained on among the veiled urns and weeping angels, tiptoeing around Marie and her friends. The fresh, bright laughter of teenagers was still something that attracted her, even now. She hadn't been to a game here in the cemetery since they were married, but every time fate took her back for a burial or a visit, she couldn't help looking down towards the pitch. Once or twice, she'd been to see her ma's plot, or Jim's, and timed it when she'd know there'd be a game on. She'd sidle down to whichever concrete pocket had 2 or 3 young folk dawdling near it. She'd say, "Game on," with surprise, as if her entire evening schedule hadn't been built around the chance of this moment. Even now, as then, there was something thrilling about the deceit of it, the free access. It was intoxicating, like a crime. Sometimes the young folk would be quiet, looking at their cans, unwilling to talk. Other times, they'd be game for a chat, and it would be like old times. Several times, she had a can or two with them. Worst was when there was no one there but her. She never lingered long in those evenings. Silence had bothered her since the headache started. And then, one day, he was there. Jim. Faint, but there. In his old guise, full punker, leather jacket, and childlike stubble. Those horrible ratty cords she teased him about. She felt no shock, just a warmth in her chest and a pounding in her head. Even without Deirdre's advice, she knew enough not to speak to him out loud around the young folk. So, she stood those few yards to the side, beside him, watching the game in silence. A few days later, he was at the headstone, then the garden plot, but usually he'd be at the cheap seats, most especially when there was a game on. After that, she always hoped there'd be no one else there. She hoped he'd go to the western part of the plots, where you could still see the game fine rightly, but which he'd never preferred. He never did. She'd added the football scenes after he died, and some part of her knew she'd done it so that if it ever did get made, she could watch them film it, up here, with Jim, so he'd see it and be proud. Now that it was happening, albeit without her involvement, she wasn't sure if he knew what he was saying. She wasn't sure if he even liked it. She watched now, as her acquaintance left the stadium and began the slow march up to the cemetery. "Ever the dramatist," she said. "God save us." Diarmid wound his way up the hill, half drunk, half dead, the same sad sack phony she had seen standing over her bed in the hospital, taking his chance to apologise to her silent face any time a nurse left the room. His eyes were burning with resentment and self-injury. He'd been sacked before, but never had it made him feel so useless, so utterly like a slapped, spoiled child. He hadn't even the courage of a thief, or the pride of a fraud. At every stage he thought he feared getting caught, and now realised he feared getting away with it worst of all. A year of his life. 22 drafts. All to end up making a show about the unifying power of punk music with a happy ending and an American lead, if she ever turned up. He crested past the mausoleums in the middle section and followed the smell of fresh earth, muttering, "Dumpna, I'm sorry." She watched him find the spot and laughed to see him kneel. Jim's words, back when he did talk, were silent, but with some strange sensation of their meaning entering her head. It was like her own thoughts in his voice, simultaneously him and not him, suffused with that warm treacle of familiarity pouring around her head once more. Sometimes he was as she remembered him as a teenager, sometimes middle-aged. Sometimes he was plucked straight from dotage, but never in a gown. Never in that hospital bed. And that was enough. He said kind things, commonplace things about her, the house, his mother, her sister. He was back, in whatever form this was, and it always wrenched her to leave him. Or he'd leave her. Mostly she'd have 10 minutes before he'd invariably fade, and she'd be left alone in the rain by herself. Or worse, with the young folk who she feared only knew her now as the mad old bird who stood too close to them when the games were on. "They're making a show about it," she said. "Remember, I told you about it before. My story, before the accident." He nodded. He was wearing the cardigan she'd given him for his 40th, which she knew had gone in the fire years before. They've changed everything, I think. Not just the names, which is probably for the best, but the events, the timeline, everything. It's Americans. Lot of money in it. Lot of clipboards. She had never had the heart to tell him that Diarmid had stolen her scripts. It was enough for Jim. Her only support. her only ally, to know that it had been good, that it had been the real deal. She wasn't even angry herself, but she knew she should be. She knew Deirdre would have been, on her behalf. And maybe the fact she'd risen above her sister's resentments cheered her slightly. Or maybe offence means less to the dead when there are other consolations, other wonders to be busy with. "Will you speak to me, Jim?" she said, softly turning in his direction. His eyes met hers with the same old soulfulness. But no reply came. He motioned to the family plot, and she collected herself. "Of course," she said. They sat by the graveside that bore their names. Hers new and clean, his above it already lined with the wear of wind and rain. "Nice that we get new flowers now. Now that I'm here," she said, surprised by her abashment. He smiled at her, still silent, but a smile nonetheless. As they walked to the plot, they found Diarmid on his knees, staring straight through them, mumbling something. When she'd imagined this moment, she thought he'd apologise, or scream disconsolately, tearfully rend his garments. But here he was, red-eyed and pathetic, too self-absorbed to mind them. It was all she could do to look at him. She didn't want an apology. His misery was enough for now. Dempna turned her back to the stadium and faced the grave. The new flowers were still fresh and red, adorning a photo of her she hated. She'd always thought it would be the one they'd choose for her when she died. It didn't look a thing like her, all proper and dolled up for a work due 15 years earlier. She'd laughed about it with Deirdre after her first appointment. "They'll use this when I die." But obviously, she'd reckoned it was the best they had after all. Dempna took Jim's hand and felt the static charge of it touching her own. She felt no fear, only calm, as she stepped through the headstone and into the earth below. William Street Baths. William Street Baths, she repeated, holding the phone in her hand. Her mouth traced each syllable, feeling its bounce and lilt as she glanced at the map in front of her, and the handwritten notes she taped to its side. She could say she'd lost track, but the truth was she was meticulous, and had kept a record of every call, every text and tweet. This was to be her 7th call of the morning, before a break for lunch. Monica had a selection of words she said to warm up. Burst, flourish, cracker, prize, daddy, mammy, compromise. She liked the music of the language and the exceptions to its ineffable rules. How the final T in words like heart, forget, won't, and regret was abrupt and dissonant. The G was cut off entirely from words like buzzin', boggin', ragin', and rippin', and the T in can't disappeared entirely, mutating into canny for reasons entirely of its own. Sometimes she thought she heard echoes of other accents she had learned for other parts. Scottish inflections, the pinched foils of Newfoundland. But she had to fight the urge to recall this while speaking, in case she got them mixed in. This was the discipline. This was the job. Being a nuisance caller was surprisingly fun. Making up the sightings was almost the best part. Trawling through unlikely places and appearances, changing the descriptions of the famous Monica Logue so that they sounded believable, but also satisfactorily different, depending on the source. She'd been working up to this one. A fully bald Monica, spotted refusing to wear a swimming cap at the local pool, on account of how she'd shaved her head. But not her armpits was the killer line that she hoped she'd read in print later that day. She got the Greyhound training into print within hours, and the guy who did the Gazette's Twitter was even quicker on the draw than that. Sometimes it was like dictation, and something she'd barely thought through would end up online in a few minutes. Sometimes they'd come complete with maps, but those took longer. She lit a cigarette, which she did before each call, as it helped her get into character. So too did the dressing gown, although she'd not yet donned the hair rollers she'd bought for just this purpose. She didn't think they were necessary now, but it was always good to have extra props to call upon should they be required. She pressed call and pursed her lips to release a plume of violet smoke. "Is this the Gazette?" "I seen her. Monica. I seen her." The use of seen instead of saw had been one of her first small victories, a detail she'd packed in her head back in California, as she studiously inhaled the accent and practiced every day. Within weeks, she'd been usefully fluent and kept her tongue sharp by listening to dairy radio and watching that one sitcom on repeat. For earlier parts, in earlier times, she would have delighted in showing it off, or running lines with colleagues, but this time she wanted to keep her proficiency under wraps. This time, she wanted to try something different. "The woman kept trying to give her a wee swimming cap," she said over the phone. "But she said, here, catch yourself on." Monica made a note that her wheeze needed work. Sometimes, it seemed like dairy people used them for all nouns, but there was some intangible upper limit she was still getting the hang of. Size was irrelevant. That much she knew already. Sandwiches were reflexively wee, but so were coats and even cars. She'd heard a bin truck referred to as wee on her first day in town. A 30-foot bin truck. How far did the scale go? She wondered. Could a quarry be wee? An asteroid? A planet? Even things of no physical scale could be wee, like thoughts. Let me have a wee think about that. And phone calls, before I give you a wee ring. But if you did need to have a wee think before you gave someone a wee ring, using the wee twice in short succession sounded false. So you'd have to choose whichever was the weer of the two. She could get the sense of phrases like catch yourself on or take your oil, but found them hard to define, and so said them anyway, hoping they made the same sense she'd felt in the voice inside her head. There were rules, she knew, coded in the dialect, hanging in the air like the damp drizzle that coated every fibre of your clothing on even a bright, cloudless day, but rules nonetheless. It's just that no one had ever written them down. So instead, she listened. Monica's was a work ethic galvanised by detail, by leaving nothing to chance or inspiration, and everything to doing the job. This had served her well over the years, but had failed to win her the plaudits of showier colleagues, co-stars who pranced about in Edwardian garb and called pizza delivery guys malud. The guys, it was always guys, from her old drama school, now winning Oscars for walking with a limp for a year, or taking cold baths in the Canadian wilderness. These were the stars who got interviewed about how hard it must have been to learn horse slaughtering, or spend a month in prison. Was it a job, or a performance of a job? She asked herself. She was stunned into boredom by actors who spoke with a lisp for 3 weeks just so that they could say that they did it. She could do that too, if she wanted. Anybody could. She turned to her phone, picking up a card on which was scribbled, "Craft Village Seamstress, mending dancing dresses." She steadied her throat and made the call, lighting a cigarette just before. And why was it always the case that method actors sank themselves deep into roles, when they played pricks. Brooding, hard-nosed bastards filled with sturm and drang. She'd not yet met an actor being offensively polite to staff and crew because they were playing a nice guy. It was always the difficult people, the difficult men, that attracted them to the role, or the chance to be a child playing dress-up in real life in service to their art. They didn't want real work. They wanted work that was as staged and ridiculous as the performances themselves. Acting wasn't enough. Not for those guys. Or for the studios who fawned on these egotists and pigeonholed Monica as a cosy TV presence, too sunny and upbeat in interviews, too knowable, too known. Whatever she did on screen, it never led to the parts her male counterparts would get. It just inspired other, bigger actresses to do the same, thereby limiting the parts available for her next time round. It was a vicious cycle, a skyscraper's worth of glass ceilings, and she had to do something drastic to break through. Her agency had shown her the metrics about her public image during a real red-letter day for her career. Her entire team in a boardroom looking at printed cards on easels that all said the same thing. There was nothing mysterious about Monica Logue. Nothing unknowable, nothing dangerous. They didn't want an actor to get the job done. They wanted an actor to play an actor playing an actor. They wanted fake authenticity. And Monica Logue reckoned she could play a callow, self-absorbed fake as authentically as anyone. A little midlife crisis was in order, but done somewhere out of sight, out of mind. Doing a drama about the Troubles, becoming Yvonne Mulvey, was only the first part of this process. A chance to show people she could do the work of stepping outside of the box they'd put her in. The dead girl, the missing woman, the cop who finds both. She would let the safe, cosy Monica Logue go missing herself and let them discover Monica Logue, tortured weirdo, in her place. She crossed out another note and checked Twitter to see what people were saying. Her quotes from an hour ago were already up. No takes from the Hollywood press yet, since it was still 4 a.m. in LA. She'd wanted to cause a stir and so far had done just that. What surprised her wasn't that they'd believed everything she'd said, or that they'd proved her accent was good enough by itself to pass herself off in character. It was that every day there were more sightings she had nothing to do with. A small fire burning from the kindling of her own lies. From following the news of her disappearance, she'd known she'd succeeded in her original intent. People were talking about her. People who would never have done so before. And there was no doubt her stock had risen as an artiste who went her own way, did her own thing. In some sense, it was disappointing just how simple it had been. She'd noticed, too, that there was a darker current to some of the coverage. Some sort of twisted glee to the idea that she might be dead. And that all their tweets and theories and homemade timelines would prove this beyond doubt. For every time she found herself thinking, they don't know what they've got until it's gone. Another, darker thought would creep in behind it. Would they forget again, just as easily once she returned? And time was up. She put on her shoes and picked up the phone for what was, by her count, her 20th call to the Gazette in the past few days. "I seen her," she said. "Monica. She was walking 8 dogs on the Lawnmower Road, and she had a big wee hat on, you know, like a Mexican's hat." Her job done, Monica picked up her other phone, the American one that had been off for a few weeks. As she turned it on, she saw it buzz and pulse into life, as hundreds, thousands of notifications came from everywhere. People checking in, furious producers, press scrambling to get her to tell them what she was doing, or asking if they could embed with her on her one-woman method acting course. She stepped outside and lit another smoke. As her phone continued to convulse, she saw the texts from her agent, all the features that were being offered, the meetings marked urgent with directors who hadn't cared for her in years. She strolled past the swimming baths and the post office, aware that a small army of people were now watching her, some filming on their phones. She could hear the beeping of trucks and the cackling of kids as she drew closer, withdrawing her hood to feel the soft rain as she wound past the cemetery and through the stadium doors. Passing a trio of Gazette reporters shouting, "Monica!" in the street, she shouted, "What about ye?" as she trundled smoking through security and up to the production area. Vin dropped his clipboard as she sauntered onto set and held a hand in the air. "Where have you been?" he said. "We thought you were dead." "I'm alive," she said, in perfect Derry speech. "Now wise up and catch yourself on."